The file had been classified for 30 years. Not secret in the way that embarrassing things are classified. A scandal buried until the people involved are dead, the principle contained, the damage managed. Secret in the way that genuinely dangerous ideas are sometimes kept. Because the people who understood what was inside it had decided that if the wider institution saw the full picture, it would take the idea and run it into the ground the way it had tried to run it into the ground before. In 1972, a British government archivist opened a green folder that had been sitting in a filing cabinet in Whitehall since 1942. The folder contained a handwritten proposal. 7 pages, written on foolscap paper by a young officer recovering from a parachute accident in a Cairo hospital. The proposal argued that the British Army was fighting the wrong war in the wrong way, that large conventional formations were exactly what the enemy expected and planned for, and that a small team of men trained to an extraordinary standard and deployed without warning into territory the enemy considered safe could achieve in a night what a brigade could not achieve in a month. The proposal had been written by a lieutenant. His name was David Stirling. The unit he proposed became the SAS. But to understand how we got here, you need to go back to before any of this had a name. The Western Desert in 1941 was the kind of war that punished conventional thinking every single day. Rommel's Afrika Korps had demonstrated, conclusively, that the side with the most tanks and the most men did not automatically win in open desert terrain. What won in the desert was speed, surprise, and the ability to appear where the enemy had calculated you could not be. The British Army understood this in theory. In practice, it continued to plan for set-piece battles, fixed supply lines, and the kind of organized industrial warfare that the First World War had made familiar. Lieutenant David Stirling, lying in a Cairo hospital in July 1941 with a parachute injury he had sustained during an unauthorized training jump, had the specific advantage of a man who cannot walk and therefore has nothing to do except think. He was 25 years old. He had been commissioned into the Scots Guards, transferred to No. 8 Commando, and had already concluded that the Commando model, large groups of trained men making set-piece amphibious landings, was producing results that did not justify its costs. His idea was simpler and more radical. Instead of landing 100 men by sea to attack a target that the enemy had prepared to defend, you sent 4 or 5 men by parachute or jeep into the deep desert behind enemy lines, walked the target on foot, destroyed it in the dark, and were gone before anyone knew you had been there. No fixed beach, no defended perimeter, no warning. The proposal he wrote in that hospital bed identified 63 airfields and supply installations across the western desert that a small team could reach and destroy, given the right training and equipment. He calculated that the disruption to Rommel's supply chain would be measurable within weeks. He submitted the proposal through a gap in a fence at General Headquarters Middle East. He could not walk through the gate. He could not get a meeting. So he found a gap in the fence and handed the paper to a passing staff officer. Before we go further, if stories told at this level of detail are what you are here for, subscribe to Deep Insight right now and never miss one. Every video goes this deep. Every story is researched to the bone. Now, back to the desert and the idea that the institution tried 3 times to bury. The British Army's response to Stirling's proposal was not immediate rejection. It was something more damaging than that. It was enthusiasm from one general and obstruction from the system that surrounded him. General Claude Auchinleck, the Commander-in-Chief Middle East, read the proposal and authorized the formation of a new unit, L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name was a deliberate deception. There was no Special Air Service Brigade. The name was invented to confuse Axis intelligence about the scale of British airborne operations. L Detachment began with 66 men. The operations that followed were, by measurable results, among the most effective of the entire Desert War. By the end of 1942, SAS teams had destroyed over 400 enemy aircraft on the ground, more than the Royal Air Force had destroyed in the air during the same period. Rommel himself acknowledged the SAS in his diaries. He called them a thorn in his side and issued a standing order that any SAS man captured was to be executed rather than taken prisoner, which was, in its way, the highest possible assessment of how seriously he took them. In 1945, the war ended. The British Army disbanded the SAS within months. Not reduced, not reorganized. Disbanded. The regimental colors were laid up. The personnel were dispersed. The unit that had destroyed more enemy aircraft than the RAF's fighter operations in the same theater was considered, by peacetime military planners, to have been a wartime improvisation with no place in the regular army. The files were classified. The operations were sealed. The proposal in the green folder went into a cabinet. And for 5 years, the most effective small unit doctrine in the history of British warfare simply ceased to officially exist. In 1950, Malaya was burning. The Malayan emergency had begun in 1948 when the Malayan Communist Party launched a guerrilla campaign against British colonial administration and the plantation economy that sustained it. The MNLA, the Malayan National Liberation Army, operated in small cells from bases deep in the jungle, emerging to attack police stations, plantation managers, and supply convoys, then disappearing back into terrain that conventional infantry patrols could enter but not operate in for any sustained period. The British Army's initial response was conventional. Large formations, sweep operations, the kind of coordinated search tactics that worked in open ground and produced almost nothing in triple canopy jungle. By 1950, the emergency had been running for 2 years, and the insurgency was not diminishing. The planners in Kuala Lumpur needed something different. What they authorized, without advertising the fact publicly, was a resurrection of a unit that had officially ceased to exist. The Malayan Scouts, as the new formation was initially designated, drew on SAS veterans and former members of wartime special operations units. Their remit was open-ended. Go into the jungle, stay there longer than the enemy, understand terrain better than the enemy, and remove the insurgents' ability to use it as a sanctuary. The unit was given no fanfare, no formal announcement, and almost no official existence. It operated under classification that kept its methods, its deployments, and its results out of the public record for years. In 1952, it was formally redesignated 22 Special Air Service Regiment. The SAS was back, and almost nobody outside the people doing the work knew it. Lieutenant Colonel John Woodhouse arrived in Malaya in the early 1950s to take command of an organization that had a name, a few hundred men, and almost no doctrine for the specific environment it was operating in. The jungle was about to provide the curriculum. Malayan jungle is not jungle in the way that word is used casually. It is triple canopy, 3 separate layers of vegetation, the highest reaching 40 meters, the middle layer blocking any view of the sky, the lowest a dense tangle of roots, vines, and undergrowth that reduces visibility to under 10 meters in places and to under 3 in the thickest terrain. It is permanently wet. It is permanently loud with insect and animal noise that masks the sound of movement and makes communication by voice unreliable at distances greater than 15 meters. It is home to approximately 250 species of snake, of which a significant number are lethal. The MNLA operated in this environment with complete confidence because they had spent years learning it. They knew which routes were passable in the wet season. They knew where the rivers ran underground and emerged 50 meters from where a map suggested. They knew which birds stopped calling when patrol was approaching, and they understood that a British infantry company could be heard in the jungle from 400 meters away. The sound of equipment, the sound of boots on wet root systems, the sound of men who were not at ease in the place they were moving through. Woodhouse understood, within his first weeks in Malaya, that the British Army's approach to jungle warfare was producing the wrong soldier for the wrong environment. Large patrol groups were too loud. Supply chains that required helicopter extraction every 3 days created predictable patterns the enemy could exploit. Soldiers who could not sustain themselves in the jungle for extended periods without resupply were soldiers who had to leave when the jungle was at its most useful. He began building something that the British Army had no official doctrine for and no existing training program to produce. A soldier who could enter the jungle and disappear into it for weeks, moving at the enemy's pace, on the enemy's timescale, in terrain the enemy had considered its own exclusive domain. The first question was what that soldier needed to know. The second question was how long it would take to teach him. The answer to the second question surprised almost everyone. The answer was longer than anyone was prepared to wait, and shorter than anyone believed possible. Woodhouse's jungle training program, which became the foundation of SAS selection and continuation training as it exists today, was built around a principle that contradicted almost everything the British Army believed about soldier preparation. The principle was this: you do not teach a man to survive in the jungle. You teach him to stop fighting the jungle, and the jungle teaches him the rest. In practical terms, this meant extended patrols that had no tactical objective beyond presence and observation. A 4-man SAS patrol in the Malayan jungle in 1953 might spend 14 days moving through an area that a company-size formation was swept into, making no contact, firing no shots, but mapping routes, identifying water sources, locating MNLA cache sites and rest areas, reading the signs of movement that the jungle left in vegetation and soil and the behavior of animals that had learned to be afraid of specific things. They learned to eat what the jungle provided, not as a survival skill, but as a logistical solution, because a patrol that did not need resupply did not need helicopters, and patrol that did not need helicopters did not announce itself from 400 meters. They learned to move at the pace of the jungle rather than the pace of patrol schedule, stopping when the environment suggested stopping, moving when it was safe to move, resting in positions that made them invisible from 3 meters rather than from 30. They learned to communicate in signals that required no sound. Hand signals refined to the point where a 4-man patrol could coordinate a contact, a withdrawal, and a rendezvous using movements that a man standing 5 meters away, if he were not one of the 4, would not recognize as communication at all. What they were building, without using the word for it, was a doctrine, a specific, transferable, teachable set of principles for operating in an environment that conventional military training had treated as an obstacle rather than a medium. The MNLA began to notice that something had changed. Patrols that had been predictable were no longer predictable. Cache sites that had been secure were being found. Men were disappearing. Between 1950 and 1960, the SAS conducted operations in the Malayan jungle that did not appear in the public record for decades. The classification was not accidental. Woodhouse and the men above him in the chain understood that the effectiveness of what they were doing depended entirely on the enemy not understanding how they were doing it. If the MNLA knew that 4-man patrols were operating in the deep jungle on 14-day rotations with no fixed resupply points, they could adapt. If they did not know, if the disappearances of fighters and the discovery of caches seemed random and inexplicable, the psychological effect was compounded by the tactical one. The specific operation that those who study it most closely consider the definitive demonstration of the SAS Malaya doctrine took place in the Telok Anson swamp in 1958. A wounded MNLA leader named Ahoy had retreated with a small group of fighters into terrain that British military planners considered impassable, an area of mangrove swamp and flooded jungle that no conventional infantry formation could enter and sustain itself in for more than a day or two. A 14-man SAS patrol entered the Telok Anson swamp and stayed for 6 weeks. They moved through terrain that was waist-deep in water in places. They ate what they could find. They maintained communication through coded radio bursts that gave nothing away about their exact position. And at the end of 6 weeks, Ahoy and his remaining fighters walked out of the swamp and surrendered. They were not captured. They chose to give up because after 6 weeks of being found in terrain they had believed was their sanctuary, they had concluded that nowhere was safe anymore. The patrol's after-action report was classified. The operation was not publicly confirmed for 20 years. Ahoy's surrender was reported as a result of extended military pressure, accurate, but not specific about what that pressure had looked like or who had applied it. The green folder in the Whitehall filing cabinet was getting heavier. By 1960, the Malayan emergency was effectively over. The MNLA had been reduced from a force of several thousand to a remnant of a few hundred, operating in the deep jungle on the Thai border with no significant capacity for organized operations. The British Army had won a counterinsurgency campaign that most military historians now consider one of the most successful in the 20th century. The combination of political reform, population resettlement, and sustained military pressure had produced a result that similar campaigns in other theaters had failed to achieve. What the public record did not show, and what the classified files contained, was a precise contribution of the SAS to that result. The files documented operations that had been conducted without public knowledge in terrain that conventional forces could not access, using methods that the British Army had officially never developed. They documented a training program that had produced soldiers capable of sustained independent jungle operations that no other unit in the British or Commonwealth order battle could replicate. And they documented the foundational doctrine, the principles of small unit deep penetration, of population-centric intelligence gathering, of operating on the enemy's timescale rather than the institutions that had made the campaign's final phase possible. The files also contained something else. They contained assessments written by officers who had served in Malaya and subsequently been posted elsewhere, describing how the doctrine developed by Woodhouse and his men had been requested, copied, adapted, and in several cases directly transplanted into the special operations frameworks of allied nations who had sent observers to see what the SAS was doing in the jungle. The United States, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Israel, all of them had sent people to learn. All of them had taken something home. None of them had been able to say precisely what they had learned or where they had learned it, because the source was classified. In 1972, the 30-year rule on British government documents meant the wartime files could be released. An archivist opened the green folder. A researcher picked it up. What they found inside, it was not the beginning of a story. It was the missing first chapter of a story that had already been running for 30 years without anyone being allowed to name its source. David Stirling died in 1990. He was knighted in 1990. In the same year, months before his death, an honor that arrived late enough that those who knew it would have understood that late was the point. John Woodhouse outlived him and spent years after his service writing about what the jungle had taught the regiment and what the regiment had taught the world. He was specific about one thing, in the interviews and memoirs he gave, that no official document had ever said clearly. He said that the doctrine the SAS had developed in Malaya was not a British invention. It was a jungle invention. The jungle had required certain things of the men who entered it, and refused to tolerate the things it did not require. The four-man patrol, the extended deployment, the absence of fixed resupply, the communication discipline, the patience, none of these came from a training manual. They came from what happened when you sent intelligent men into an environment that punished every wrong decision and rewarded only the correct ones. He said the jungle was the best training officer the regiment ever had. He said it had never been properly credited. The green folder contains 7 pages. The idea inside those 7 pages has been replicated, adapted, and built upon by the special operations communities of more than 20 nations. The Delta Force model came from men who had studied the SAS model. The Australian SASR doctrine came from men who had trained alongside the SAS in Malaya. The selection process, the long march, the wait, the navigation without support, the standards that most candidates do not meet, exists in one form or another in every serious special operations unit on Earth. All of it traces back to a lieutenant in a Cairo hospital with a parachute injury and 7 pages of foolscap paper. The file was opened in 1972. Most of the world is still reading what was inside it. Subscribe to Deep Insight right now. Every story goes this deep. Like this video, the detail about what happened in the Telok Anson swamp changed how you think about what patience actually means in warfare. Leave a comment. Which part of the story do you think has had the most influence on the military forces of today? And drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from.